The Civil War rivalry between Oregon and Oregon State will take place this Saturday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 12:30 p.m. Pacific Time. This is a noticeable change from previous iterations of Civil War, which happened on the last week of the regular season. And before the Pac-10 expanded to the Pac-12, they would sometimes happen even in the first few days of December when other teams were playing their conference championship games. You know, the SEC and the Big 12 then, and then the Pac-10 went to the Pac-12. The Big 10 stayed the Big 10 in name only because they expanded to Nebraska, then Rutgers and Maryland, and then they took Oregon, Washington, USC, and UCLA. The Big 12 poached Arizona, Arizona State, Colorado, and Utah. Cal and Stanford made a lateral move at the last minute to the ACC. And the Pac-12 now consists of really the memed Pac-2 between Oregon State and Washington State, who are now not in the same conference as their in-state rivals. So they play in the non-conference slate, really at the middle, some years closer to the end of September. That's where we are. That is one of the changes that comes with college football conference realignment that I hate, is the fact that rivalries like this, like Civil War and the Apple Cup, are put in jeopardy. Now, these two schools, to their credit, Oregon and Oregon State, and Washington State have also done this. They've put a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. They have at least tried to keep this rivalry going for the next few seasons. I know that Oregon versus Oregon State also takes place next year, not just this year. But Jonathan Smith was building something special at Oregon State, and I think you will see something special built at Michigan State. Dan Lanning obviously has a machine running at Oregon, a machine that I think needs some oil in the engines and that needs a refueling based off of their first 2 weeks. But nonetheless, they're recruiting very well, developing very well, and they're still ranked a top 10 team. And that's very understandable. But they're only entering this game favored by 16 points. And that's because Oregon has only won their first two games by an average of 6.5 points. Meanwhile, the Oregon State Beavers have done fairly well, given all they've lost. And they look like a Walmart, Kmart version of their former selves. There's still clearly pieces from Jonathan Smith's team and from the foundation that he built there. So I'm going to preview this game, give a prediction, give a deep dive breakdown. But before we get into that, I want you, yes, you watching, whether you're an Oregon fan, Oregon State fan, or college football fan in general, I want you to subscribe to the channel, to click that big red subscribe button, and also hit the notification bell beside it. I want you to like the video, and I also want you to share this video around to other college football fans, and comment your preview, your prediction, your analysis, a reason why you're picking either Oregon or Oregon State to win this game. Comment that down below. All of those things don't take that much time. They help us get into the algorithm, help us to earn a bigger following, and also help us to earn income, earn money, which we reinvest into this channel to make it better for you, produce higher quality content, cover more games, and just get better at what we're doing here. And right now, I believe that we are the best Big Ten football channel on YouTube, and we strive to be the best college football channel on YouTube, and to always innovate, always improve. And your feedback, whether on predictions or reactions to games, just your comments in the comment section and your likes, subscriptions, they matter that much. And we're going to be giving back to you once we reach 20,000 subscribers. There'll be a big giveaway that you won't want to miss. But getting into this game a little more, and also side note, if you want to support the channel in more ways than that, you can visit my Patreon page or merchandise store via the links in the description or pinned comment. And please, through the link in the pinned comment, join our Discord server so that we can have explosive Saturdays for college football, not just watching the games, but also talking about them amongst ourselves. Diving into this game, I do see an interesting trend here. The fact that Oregon, clearly from a preseason point of view, is overhyped, or they were overhyped. And analytics would actually say they still are. They fell outside of the top 10 in ESPN's FPI. They are not rated highly at all by Simple Ranking System. And yet they're still ninth in the AP poll. And many people still say that this is a team where if they get their pieces right, they can win a national championship. And the evidence for the first two games says kind of the exact opposite. The evidence through the first two games says, unless there are drastic changes, that this is just a great, near elite team. And clearly a team that I don't think has the type of explosiveness or high ceiling or potential or cohesiveness and strength that last year's team had. Clearly the loss of Jackson Powers Johnson, Bo Nix, Troy Franklin, Bucky Irving has hurt the team. And those players, whether Jackson Powers Johnson being the epitome of strength on the team and commanding one of the nation's best offensive lines, or Nix, Irving, and Franklin, who really provided a ton of explosive plays and extra depth, you see those aspects missing from this Oregon team. That's why they had to rely on their raw athleticism to escape Boise State, where they had a punt return for a touchdown. They had a kick return for a touchdown. Trayshawn Holden basically took a slant to the house because Oregon's that much faster than Boise State in basically every way outside of running back, where Ashton Jeanty may be the best of that position group in the nation, could be one of the best players, period, in all of college football, and probably is. Oregon was outgained by the Broncos. They lost the turnover battle. Against Idaho, they outgained Idaho by nearly double, actually a little more than double the yards that Idaho put up, and they won the turnover battle by 1, and they dominated possession time, but they could just not finish on their drives. 0 of 2 on fourth down, couldn't run the ball to save their life, couldn't protect Dylan Gabriel. You saw similar themes against Boise State, although the special teams did come out, they exploded, and they turned the ball over more. So it was really the same thing, consistently inconsistent. That is what Oregon has been. And the most consistent part about their team has been, outside of the fact that Dylan Gabriel is still accurate relative to completions out of attempts, when you watch his in-game performance, he looks worse than the stats would indicate. The offensive line cannot protect Gabriel. They cannot help Jordan James run the football, though I think through 2 games it's now clear that they are better at run block than pass block, just from what Jordan James has done and the fact that Gabriel's just getting massive amounts of pressure. He's already been sacked close to 10 times, and last year's offensive line didn't even allow 5 sacks throughout the whole season. We'll have to see how the offensive line does. And the defensive line, they have not been as bad, and I know that facing Ashton Jeanty is a challenge for any defensive line, but Boise State was opening up some holes in that defensive line, which is highly talented. Oregon did a lot in the portal to upgrade that defensive line, and that was even with Jeffrey Bassa back at linebacker, a critical piece, and Boise State was still able to have tons of success on the ground against Oregon. For Oregon State, the Beavers, over their past 2 games, I'm going to keep it more brief here with the Beavers because they've played a weaker strength of schedule. They've played Idaho State, who had a losing record in the FCS last year, and San Diego State is just not that good. But they shut out San Diego State. They beat Idaho State 38-15. They have done a better job compared to Oregon at protecting their quarterback and running the football. And we don't know if they are actually better on defense than Oregon, particularly at stopping the run, but statistics say they are. So this is an interesting matchup in my mind. And Oregon being favored by 16 points after opening up as a 14-point favorite shows that a lot of people do expect Oregon to bounce back and correct their weaknesses. I think a lot of people still believe that Oregon is a near elite to elite team that just has to figure themselves out. And to a certain degree, you can understand that with the injuries they've sustained on the offensive line, where I don't know if Matthew Bedford is healthy, and they did lose a good amount of production, specifically on the interior from last season. But then there are also things that just don't make sense, like the fact that a Johnny Cornelius and Josh Connerly Jr. look worse this year at pass blocking than last year, despite being one of the best, if not the best tackle duos in the nation last year, only being rivaled by, Oregon State and Washington and maybe Georgia. And they return, and they somehow regress despite the added experience and preseason training and all the things that should go in their favor. That doesn't make sense at all, but it's there. We have 2 samples now where Oregon has struggled in pass protection. And quarterback consistency is something else to pay attention to as well. I don't think quarterback is a weakness for Oregon, by the way. It may be a weak link, but I don't think Dylan Gabriel is the biggest problem for Oregon right now. I mean, 59 of 70 for 623 yards and 4 touchdowns. He's outside of the top 50 in QBR, and I think he is a worse player than I or most expected him to be entering this season, just based off of the fact that he's turned the ball over, and he does not look comfortable in this offense quite yet. But that may be a timing thing, as in he just needs more snaps, though he's, again, already passed it 70 times, and at that point, you have a lot of reps on the field, a lot of plays under your belt with this offense, so you'd hope to see some improvement soon. But he may need even more time, and the offensive line isn't doing him any favors either, and I think with a much better offensive line, despite the fact that he lacks Nix's explosiveness, potential, and I would even say his accuracy, overall, with a much better offensive line, I think Gabriel would be much better suited in this offense or any offense, because the offensive line is just that important, especially for a program like Oregon, who, they want to get big plays. They want to dominate you on the ground. Oregon doesn't want to run an air raid where they're getting the ball out quickly to compensate for a lack of offensive line play. And it seems like at times that's what Oregon is doing. They're trying to get the ball out quickly because of their inconsistency in the trench play. We'll talk about this and how Tez Johnson's stat line kind of just shows that. He's not even averaging close to 10 yards per reception, and he's a really good wide receiver. The defensive line, as I talked about earlier, is also something to consider as a concern. I say this because you look at Oregon's rushing defense, which last year was respectable. It was good. I don't think it was elite, but it was a good unit. And that's why some people were high on Oregon's D-line this year to make strides, as they added 2 good tackles, defensive tackles from the portal, in Derek Harmon and Jamari Caldwell, and they brought back Jordan Birch and some other depth pieces. But this year, in defending the run, Oregon is allowing 33 rushing attempts per game. Huge part of that, again, is Boise State. 221 opponent rushing yards per game. It's 107th. And this is also factoring in Idaho. Idaho did an okay job running the ball. Not an elite job, not even a good job, just okay, and then Boise State crushed it on the ground. Oregon is allowing an average of 9 rushing first downs per game and 6.7 yards per carry, which is 125th nationally. So even when factoring in Ginty, this rushing defense does have some problems, and I think Oregon State may be able to take advantage of that, and we'll talk about that when I discuss Oregon State's strengths. But I want to get to Oregon State's weaknesses first. Oregon is all athleticism right now. That doesn't mean they're not physical whatsoever or that they don't have good players in the trenches. They do. I just think there needs to be some more cohesion. They need to figure out the depth chart a little bit more. And I don't know exactly what's going on with Oregon's offensive line, I got to be honest. I'd expect their offensive line to be better than Oregon State's offensive line, but here we are. Oregon State looks like they actually have the better offensive line through 2 games. The weaknesses for the Beavers are their passing offense and their special teams. Their kicker is currently 1 of 3 on field goals, and their quarterback and wide receiver room got gutted from last year. Aiden Childs and DJ Uiagalelei are now at different schools. Silas Bolden, and I forget the other wide receiver for the Oregon State Beavers. He went off to the NFL though. Gold, I think, was his last name. They're both gone. They were the main threats. Jack Velling was also a threat through the air. And the offensive line, a lot of their players went off to the NFL, but some of them returned too. And even though quarterback, I think Oregon State sort of saved that room with what they got in the portal, it's clearly a downgrade from last year. So this passing offense is not how Oregon State operates and wins games. They don't operate through the passing attack. They run to set up the pass. In fact, they're running on nearly 60% of their plays. Take a look at Oregon State's rushing offense. Their scoring offense is right now, so let me find it here on my chart. Their scoring offense is 74th. Only score 21 points per game on average. And this only counts FBS opponents. It's the same thing with Oregon as well. But again, Idaho did run a decent amount of them. So it's actually, if you factor in the FCS opponent, which in this matchup is critical, I would say, in a certain way, because Idaho's a lot better than Idaho State. So if you factored in the FCS opponents here, these statistics that I'm reading you may be a little closer, but I think you'd be surprised that Oregon State's leading in a lot of these categories, and that's even if you were to factor in the games against their FCS opponents, because, well, Idaho put up over 200 yards and around 2 touchdowns on Oregon. Idaho State did about the same thing as well. But Oregon State's scoring offense isn't that good. However, when you look at their rushing offense, they are running a ton. They're running the ball a lot. And against San Diego State, they ran for 237 yards. Oregon State did. Against Idaho State, the Beavers scored 38 points, and on the ground, they had 362 rushing yards, 6.2 yards per carry, 4 rushing touchdowns. Their long rush was 23, so they were consistently getting like 4 or 5 yards per pop, which is very good against anyone, FCS or not. That's a very impressive stat line to put up. And they only passed 14 times in that game, and they ran 58 times against Idaho State. So this team wants to run the football. They do not want to pass the football whatsoever. And look at just their passing offense here. They only pass for less than 30 attempts per game. They don't complete the ball well either. Their completion percentage sits currently at about 62, 63%. They're under 200 passing yards per game. Their quarterback, though, their QBs have been very, very well protected. I'll just put it that way. They didn't allow a single sack against San Diego State, and they passed the ball a lot more there. They also have one of the higher-rated guards and offensive lines by Pro Football Focus, specifically on the interior. So the strength of the Beavers is running the ball, but passing offense and special teams where their kicker has just not looked good. Their punter isn't even averaging 40 yards per punt attempt. That's a clear weakness for the Beavers. Oregon's strengths are their pass offense, their athleticism, as I already mentioned, and you look at the skill positions along with corner where Jabbar Muhammad resides, the incoming transfer from Washington, who's already looked great in his first 2 games, and I can't wait to see what he does against Ohio State, for example, as they're probably the only team that will have a great wide receiver core that Oregon plays in the regular season. The only one. Oregon's schedule's very manageable. So from a strength of record standpoint, or from people ranking teams based off of where they think they'll finish, I understand the sentiment that Oregon could even be like a top 5 team, because 11-1 looks, I'll tell you, it looks very likely right now. Like 10-2, 11-1, 9-3 is possible, just like in the preseason, but Michigan and Wisconsin look weaker than I thought, and actually weaker than a lot of people thought as well. Illinois looks stronger, but For example, a lot of these smaller schools that Oregon will play outside of Michigan, Ohio State, and even the Badgers, a lot of them will be at home or they're in nice spots for Oregon, like nice breaks in the schedule where I think their talent could still overpower an improved, smaller, medium-sized Big Ten team. But even with Gabriel's inconsistency, you have to look at this passing offense and the fact that they can create explosive plays even if they're not designed that way. With Evan Stewart, with Trayshawn Holden, with Tez Johnson, their special teams have clearly improved with kicker Atticus Sappington and the fact that they got 2 touchdowns off of special teams from returns against Boise State, which won Oregon the game. I mean, again, Boise State won the turnover battle. They outgained Oregon in first downs, and they had more total yards and led by about a minute the time of possession battle. But Oregon's special teams scoring touchdowns is what won them the game, kept them in it long enough for Oregon to go on a 3-minute, 36-yard drive on 11 plays, one of their few consistent drives of the night, as all other drives in that game were, am I reading this right? Yeah, 6 plays or less. Yikes. Yeah, again, with the consistently inconsistent part. They finally put together a good, solid, consistent drive where Atticus Sappington kicked a chip shot 25-yard field goal. And Oregon right now, their average team passer rating's 214.3. That was it against Boise State. Dylan Gabriel on the season has had a 177.9 passer rating. He's completing 84.3% of his passes, 623 passing yards on 70 attempts. And if not for his 7 sacks, he'd probably break even or maybe have positive rushing yards. Their yards per pass attempt gained is 11.6. That's again against Boise State because this chart, which I get from not sportsreference.com, I forget exactly what website it's from, but I use Sports Reference, I use ESPN, I use this website that I'm going to look, college football stats. Yeah, teamrankings.com, college football stats. They don't count FCS games, which I kind of think is pretty smart, I'm not going to lie, because most of the time they're just blowout wins for Power 4 teams, even for some Group of 5 teams. And sometimes when there's a little bit of a struggle with these smaller schools, you have to take it with a grain of salt. Like Michigan versus Bowling Green last year could be the case for Penn State versus Bowling Green this year. Or Ohio State. They struggled against Youngstown State last year for a quarter, for a half, and they were one of the best teams in college football last season. So I think it's wise, but I just want to bring up both teamrankings.com stats and also the total, because both of these teams have played an FCS opponent, and our sample size is so small that the more information we can have, the better. Oregon, I mean, look, 59 out of 70 is Dylan Gabriel's stat line, only 11 incompletions. It's just, their passing offense is still ridiculously efficient, especially when Gabriel has a clean pocket, and he's really doing all that he can do with the offense and the offensive line situation. You also got to love Tez Johnson, Evan Stewart, Trayshawn Holden. Hopefully Gary Bryant Jr. can be healthy. It's one of the best wide receiver corps in the country. Jordan James is averaging over 6 yards per carry. And Atticus Sappington, he missed an extra point against Boise State, but he has done his job in the kicking department, helping Oregon earn a walk-off field goal against Boise State. He was good at Oregon State, and the return game looks elite. So the Ducks are strong in areas that require the most athleticism, except for kicker, which I think requires perhaps the most mental toughness. So there is something to Oregon struggling in the trenches, finishing their games with W's, and doing it in a style where, yeah, they don't look very impressive, but they also look scary, because a team that can return kickoffs and punts like that, can take slant routes to the house, that has a downfield passing threat to them that I just don't think has been unlocked yet, due to whether it's the O-line or the offense adjusting from Nix to Gabriel. There's a lot to be scared about with Oregon. With Oregon State, something that I think is scary about them is their consistency. How they have pounded the rock and they have ran the ball for 65% of their play percentage. And if you factored in the FCS opponent, this would be well above 70. They just run the ball. And I know Oregon has a better defense than Idaho State or San Diego State, but they run the ball with Jam Griffin and Anthony Hakerson, who are not Damian Martinez, and they just have success with it. And what that communicates to me is their offensive line's pretty darn good. Because when you have running backs, one of whom wasn't really, wasn't dominant at Colorado, which is hard because their O-line sucks, but he was just in the rotation, not the clear starter. Jam Griffin didn't touch the ball that much at Ole Miss. He transferred to Ole Miss from Oregon State because he was behind Damian Martinez. You have two running backs who, as of what we know, are not great players, and they are doing phenomenally well given how one-dimensional the offense is. That speaks, combined with the fact that they didn't allow a sack against San Diego State, and I don't know when they allowed the sacks against Idaho State. They allowed 2, but one was to the backup QB, so I imagine they didn't allow much pressure there either. This offensive line's good. It's a strength. It may even be a non-negotiable given how many of them were developed by the former offensive line coach who left for the Michigan State Spartans with Jonathan Smith. He took the entire offensive staff with him, didn't bring Trent Bray, who's obviously the head coach for the Beavers. Jim Michalczyk, he was elite at his job, one of the best offensive line coaches in the country. And there are many players starting at Oregon State right now in the trenches who are developed by him year over year over year. So I think this offense benefits still from Smith's system and his foundation. The defense is a lot like Trent Bray's defense. They are aggressive, they are savvy, and as of what we can tell right now, they do have a good defense. It's not great, it's not elite, but it's what a Trent Bray defense has been at Oregon State for the years that he's been there. Just good. And that's what Oregon State needed under Jonathan Smith with their offense, was just good, especially in the Pac-12, where defenses typically at best were like average or above average or good, like outside of Utah. Utah was the only team that would have great elite defenses consistently and NFL players constantly on defense. Jonathan Smith and Trent Bray did change that a bit and put together good defenses with limited talent. I still think you see a remnant of that. Oregon State rushes for, 237 yards per game. It'd be more of that if they factored in the FCS opponent team rankings did. You look at their rushing defense. Oregon State has only allowed 72 rushing yards per game against San Diego State, against Sean Lewis, whose specialty at Kent State was getting players to just run the football like crazy. They've only allowed 1 rushing first down against San Diego State. And against Idaho State, where they won 38-15, Idaho State ran the ball for actually 5.1 yards per carry, but only on 16 carries. Idaho State passed for 45 attempts, and they averaged 5.1 yards per attempt, mixed in a ton of quarterbacks, and threw 2 picks along with 2 touchdowns. So I think this defense is strong. I think Oregon State's a team with all they lost that they'll get better in every game. Run offense and run defense, and with some of the secondary players they have that I've been impressed by, I think those are their areas of strength. I look at the impact players for both of these teams. Oregon, it's quarterback Dylan Gabriel, running back Jordan James, Evan Stewart, and Tez Johnson at wide receiver, and linebacker Jeffrey Bassa. Oregon's goal is to protect Dylan Gabriel and get Oregon State off of the field. Gabriel is 59 of 70 for 623 yards, 4 touchdowns, has a 53.5 quarterback efficiency rating. He needs to do a better job of holding onto the football and of finding ways to escape pressure, because the penalties of Oregon's offensive line and the fact that they have allowed constant pressure to get to Gabriel, or procedural errors like illegal shifts or formations that have been on Oregon, which is, I think, on the entire team at that point, including the coaching staff, those do not help the offense find consistency. I think Jordan James has done his job with nearly 200 rushing yards and 32 attempts and a touchdown. It's just, again, the offensive line determines the running game more than the running back does. You see this with a player like Kenneth Walker, who was the nation's best running back in 2021. But when his offensive line, which was just average, above average, faced up against teams that could score quickly on Michigan State's defense and that also had competent defenses, namely Ohio State, but even Purdue, for example, he was essentially not totally taken out of the game in the case of Purdue, but totally taken out of the Ohio State game, and was not as big of an effect in the Purdue game as Michigan State wanted him to be. Evan Stewart has had a receiving touchdown. Tez Johnson has had 2 receiving touchdowns. Something interesting to look at is Tez Johnson actually had negative yardage against Boise State, and he's had 80 receiving yards and 15 receptions. He's barely averaging above 5 yards per reception. Oregon's passing game is just taking what they can get and getting the ball out quickly, in part, I think, because of pressure and the fact that Dylan Gabriel does not have the arm strength that Bo Nix did. He does not have that same dynamic playmaking capability. On defense, the one player I'm looking at is Jeffrey Bassa. That's because I don't think Oregon needs to play good defense necessarily to win this game, because Oregon State's one-dimensional. But what they need to do is they need a field general like Bassa, particularly because he's a part of the defensive front, to be gap sound, to command the defense well, to make adjustments, and to slow down Oregon State's running attack. He's had 9 tackles, 1 solo tackle, and a pass defended. He did not play much against Idaho. I think they were just managing their roster. Dan Lanning and his staff were. He had significant action against Boise State. And finally, with Oregon State, run the ball, control the clock, and drag out drives. Keep Oregon's offense off the field. I look at running backs Jam Griffin and also Anthony Hankerson, who have had nearly 80 rushing attempts for close to 500 total yards. They're both averaging well over 5 yards per carry. They each have 3 rushing touchdowns. They've done a great job behind what I think is a powerful offensive line this year. Defensive tackle, Ty Robinson is not an Oregon State defensive tackle. My apologies for that typo. Samisi Saluni, he saw action in both of Oregon State's games, and he's a starter. He's rated modestly highly by Pro Football Focus. It's important for him to step up and have a big game to put pressure on Oregon's interior offensive line. Oregon State, from what I understand on their defensive line, is better at run block than they are at getting to the quarterback. I mean, Oregon State doesn't have all that many sacks against 2 pretty weak teams. I think that's pretty indicative that they don't have that much of a pass rush. For them, I think it's more important to play good in the secondary with strong safety Jack Kane, free safety Skylar Thompson, and shut down the rushing attack. Rely on your secondary to try and slow down the passing offense and just try and neuter the rushing offense if you can. Again, run the ball, control the clock, drag out drives. I think that's Oregon State's. I think that's their path to victory. My score prediction ultimately is Oregon 31, Oregon State 21. I think just Oregon State is too one-dimensional to win this game. I think that Oregon is going to come out on top. They're going to cover the spread. They're going not cover. My apologies. They're going to win, and it won't be this, down to the wire type performance. Oregon State will cover, but Oregon State won't cover because these two teams are equal. It's a rivalry game where I think Oregon State potentially has an advantage in the trenches, or at least it's pretty similar. It's a pretty even battle there, but Oregon just has the far better quarterback, far better receivers, and they're more athletic. They're going to eventually, I mean, Oregon State here has to basically play perfect to win this game because Oregon has more than enough athleticism to where if Oregon State makes one mistake, well, they have a long touchdown, or they have a kick return, or a punt return, or if Oregon wins the turnover battle, given their superior offense, they're more likely to take advantage of turnovers than Oregon State will. Oregon State basically has to play a perfect game, and I don't like picking a team to play a perfect game ever because that's very rare. So I'm picking Oregon to win 31-21, but I am picking Oregon State to cover. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts on this video down below. Thanks to Crash2488 and Barasco Rascal for being Heisman Patreon members. Thanks to Chris Lane, Kind of Little OH, Ismar, Tyler Nye, and Chilton Cush for being All-American members. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell for being All-Conference Patreon members. If you want to support the channel, check out my Patreon link or my merchandise store via the links in the description or down below in the pinned comment. Have a great day, guys, and I will see you all soon. Bye-bye.